The cold water ran down Chanel's fingers as she stared at her reflection in the tiny bathroom mirror. She was exhausted, barely holding it together, but she had no choice. Rent was due, groceries were low, and her son, Malik, needed new shoes for school. Being a single black mother in a city that never stopped moving wasn't easy. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep a roof over their heads. So, when she saw an ad offering big money for a caretaker position, she didn't think twice before applying. It wasn't glamorous, but money was money. What she didn't expect was the man behind the job, Isaiah Caldwell, a name she had heard before, but never paid attention to. He wasn't just rich, he was wealthy, the kind of man who didn't walk but commanded a room, the kind of man who made headlines. But now, all that power, all that success, was trapped inside a body that no longer listened to him. A freak accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and from what Chanel had read online, he wasn't exactly adjusting well. Still, that wasn't her problem. Her job was simple. Come in, take care of him, and leave with a paycheck. No emotions, no attachments, just business. But from the moment she stepped inside his massive penthouse, she felt something shift. The air was thick with tension. A silence that carried weight. Isaiah sat in his chair, staring at her with an intensity that made her question if she'd made the right decision. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied her like she was some puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. "You're the new one." His voice was deep, rough, like he didn't have time for small talk. Chanel swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, Chanel." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his chair and wheeled himself toward the large floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline. "They all quit," he finally said. "Some after a week, some after a day." Chanel shifted her weight, gripping the strap of her purse. "I'm not them." Isaiah let out a dry chuckle. "We'll see." The days that followed weren't easy. Chanel was used to hard work, but Isaiah made everything 10 times harder. He was stubborn, angry, and had a sharp tongue that cut deeper than most. Some days, it felt like he was daring her to quit, but she didn't. She needed the job, and more than that, somewhere deep down, she saw something in him. Beneath all the walls, all the bitterness, was a man who was hurting. One night, after a long and frustrating day, Chanel found herself sitting across from him at the dining table. It had started as an awkward silence, but somehow conversation found its way between them. "You got kids?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. "Yeah," she said, stirring her tea. "Malik, he's 7. Isaiah nodded slowly, as if processing that. "His dad around?" Chanel let out a small, humorless laugh. "Nope, never was." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Isaiah said, "My dad left when I was 10. She looked up, surprised. He had never shared anything personal before. "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged. "You get used to people leaving." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as cold as he wanted people to believe. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late. She had just finished cleaning up when she heard him call her name. His voice wasn't sharp this time. It was different. When she stepped into his room, she found him sitting there, looking almost vulnerable. "I need help," he admitted, his pride clearly making the words difficult. Chanel nodded, stepping closer. "With what?" His jaw tightened, and he gestured toward the bathroom. "A bath." She blinked. He had never asked her for something so personal before. For a second, she hesitated, but then she saw the look in his eyes. Frustration, embarrassment, and something else. Trust. She took a breath and nodded. Okay, as she helped him, something shifted between them. The space that had always felt cold and distant now felt different. She saw him, not just as the millionaire in the wheelchair, but as a man. And as her hands carefully moved, her heart did something she never expected. It softened. But she wasn't the only one feeling it, because Isaiah, the man who had built walls higher than his penthouse, was looking at her like she was the first person who had truly seen him in a long, long time. And that's when everything started to change. After that night, something between Chanel and Isaiah shifted. It wasn't spoken about, but it was felt. A silent understanding, an unspoken closeness. She still came to work, still did her job. But now there were moments, glances held too long, conversations that went beyond small talk. Moments when the air felt thick with something neither of them were ready to name. Isaiah, for the first time in a long time, felt like someone saw him beyond the chair, beyond the pity. Chanel didn't walk on eggshells around him, didn't treat him like he was fragile or less of a man. She argued with him when he was being difficult, laughed at him when he was being ridiculous, and didn't hesitate to challenge him when he pushed too hard. And maybe that's what scared him the most, because he had spent so long building walls, keeping people out. The accident had taken more than just his ability to walk. It had stolen his pride, his confidence, his belief that he could ever be the man he once was. And yet, here was this woman, this single mother just trying to make ends meet, who somehow saw past all of it. But Isaiah wasn't the only one fighting feelings. Chanel told herself over and over that this was just a job, that Isaiah was just another client, another paycheck keeping her and Malik afloat. But late at night, when she lay in bed, she found herself thinking about him, about the way his voice softened when he talked about his past, about the way his hands clenched when he was frustrated, like he was still at war with himself, about the way he looked at her sometimes, like she was the only thing holding him together. She couldn't let herself go there. She had too much on her plate: bills, Malik, her own dreams that she had pushed aside for so long. There wasn't room for feelings, especially not for a man like Isaiah Caldwell. But feelings didn't care about logic. One evening, as Chanel was gathering her things to leave, Isaiah spoke up. "Stay for dinner," she froze, glancing at him. "What? Dinner?" he repeated, his voice a little more unsure this time. "I had my chef make extra." She hesitated. This wasn't part of the job. This wasn't professional. But before she could think too much about it, she nodded. Okay. They ate together at the long dining table, the city lights twinkling through, the floor-to-ceiling windows. The conversation flowed easier than she expected. He asked about Malik, about her life before she started working for him. She asked about his business, about what drove him before the accident. And then he asked something that made her pause. If you could do anything, if money wasn't an issue, what would you do? She blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Not really. She let out a small breath. I wanted to be a nurse, she admitted. I started school, but life happened. Isaiah studied her for a moment. You should go back. She let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, let me just pull a couple grand out of my pocket real quick. He didn't laugh. I'm serious. She looked at him. Something unreadable in his expression, and for a split second, she let herself imagine it. A life where she wasn't just scraping by. A life where she wasn't constantly worried about money. But dreams didn't pay the bills. The tension between them only grew from there. Every interaction, every touch that lasted a second too long, every look that lingered. It all built up, like a storm waiting to break, and then the storm hit. It was late. She had just finished helping him for the night, when the power in the building flickered. A summer storm had rolled in, rain pounding against the glass windows. Isaiah was quiet, staring out at the storm, lost in thought. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. Chanel frowned. "Leaving where?" "This life. This struggle. Just starting over." She let out a breath. "Every day." He turned his gaze to her then, and there was something in his eyes. Something raw. "What if you could?" Her heart thumped. "Isaiah, let me help you." She shook her head immediately. "No, I don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," he argued. "It's me investing in someone who deserves more." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to owe you." His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain pounded harder outside, thunder rumbling in the distance. And then, before she could stop herself, she reached for his hand. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His fingers tightened around hers. "Because you make me feel like I'm still me." The air between them was electric, charged with everything they had been avoiding. She should have pulled away. She should have left. But she didn't, and neither did he. Neither of them knew that this moment, this night, was going to change everything, because love wasn't supposed to be part of the deal. But love doesn't wait for permission. It just happens. Chanel knew she should have let go of Isaiah's hand, but she didn't. Something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing grounding him, made it impossible to pull away. But reality crashed in fast. She wasn't supposed to feel this, wasn't supposed to want this. She had a son to think about. A life that didn't include getting wrapped up in a man like Isaiah Caldwell, no matter how much her heart whispered. Otherwise, she pulled her hand back and stood quickly. "I should go." Isaiah's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Chanel." She didn't let him finish. She grabbed her bag and walked out, ignoring the way her chest tightened with every step. For the next few days, she kept her distance. She came to work, did her job, and left without lingering. She told herself it was for the best, that whatever moment they had shared was just that, a moment, nothing more. But Isaiah didn't make it easy. He wasn't cold toward her, wasn't distant. If anything, he was more present, watching her, waiting, as if he was giving her time to decide if she was going to run forever. Then, everything changed. Chanel was leaving for the night when her phone rang. It was Malik's school. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. "Miss Johnson, Malik had an asthma attack during recess." The school nurse explained. "He's stable, but we had to call an ambulance." Chanel's hands shook. "Which hospital?" She barely heard the answer before she was running. By the time she reached the hospital, Malik was resting, but the sight of him hooked up to monitors still made her heart clench. "You should have told me," a deep voice said behind her. She turned to see Isaiah in the doorway. She blinked, shocked. "What are you doing here?" He exhaled. "You were scared. I knew you wouldn't call anyone, so I came." Tears burned her eyes. She was too tired to argue, too overwhelmed to push him away, so she didn't. That night, he stayed. He didn't leave her side. And when Malik woke up, Isaiah sat with him, talking to him like he had known him forever. Something inside Chanel cracked. This man, the one she had spent weeks convincing herself she couldn't fall for, was already a part of her life. And maybe she didn't want to fight it anymore. The next morning, as they stepped outside, Chanel turned to him. "Isaiah," she started, voice unsure. He looked at her, waiting. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what this is. I don't know if I'm ready for it." He nodded, stepping closer. "Then let's figure it out together." She let out a breath, then nodded. "Okay." For the first time in a long time, She didn't feel like she was fighting alone, and maybe, just maybe, love had found her when she least expected it.